Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Friends of the Dar, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. On behalf of Dar al-Athar al-Islamiyyah, I welcome you to the opening of the 29th cultural season. We look forward to an interesting and informative season, a season of discovery. Tonight, it is the express honor of Dar al-Athar al-Islamiyyah to present the annual Tareq Rajab Museum lecture in commemoration of that museum's generous participation in our yearly cultural season. The Tareq Rajab Museum is a true friend of the Dar. In the vast majority of cases, the actual history of museum objects, who owned it, who made it, etc., is not actually known. However, to a lesser extent, some objects in museums are clearly defined provenance, with stories and histories that are clearly documented and known. Tonight's talk is titled "The Story Behind the Objects." We'll focus on a small selection of objects from the Tareq Rajab Museum. These objects have fascinating histories and stories, a manuscript with interesting history, a vase by a celebrated potter, or a sword gifted by a Maharaja. These are some of the artifacts that will be included in the talk. We are lucky that Dr. Ziad has such a rich treasure box in the museum to dig into and find such immensely useful items with their history to discuss. One thing I hope he will never find when he digs in his treasure box is a mobile phone. So please, dig in your pockets, turn off your mobile phones, and let's welcome Dr. Ziad.
Good evening, Sheikh Hassa, Dar al-Athar, also Dr. Heba, who I was very, very happy to see this morning. It was a really nice surprise. And being here, of course, is always, I don't know, it's just this welcoming cultural atmosphere that we have when we come here. And I was talking about it to you, right? No, to Nawaf sitting somewhere there. We are saying it's so nice being in this environment here, really, and something we look forward to every September. And you come in and you feel you're in a bubble somewhere. So thank you to Dar al-Athar, to Sheikh Hassa, and thank you also for having me every year, because I keep worrying that I'm going to bore you stiff, and you'll say, how do we get rid of this guy? So thank you for having me again. Now, and thank you, Abu Dalal, for the introduction. Of course, every year I rack my brains. And what am I going to talk about today? Yes, we have a treasure trove, but sometimes you walk into the museum and all you see is ceramics, and you think, yeah, but I mean, I'm not really a specialist in ceramics, so how will I make anything interesting unless I actually know 100% what I'm talking about? But this year, and many years, this isn't the first time, this year somebody in the museum said, you know what I like in the museum, in your museum, in museums in general, is when there's a story. There's some objects we know who the object was owned by. And so it's interesting to know who that person was, whoever they were, wherever they were in the world. And I thought, yeah, that'll be an interesting subject for a talk, to bring objects alive in the museum. So we're not just looking at glass or metal or ceramics, as interesting as they are, but we've got a context. So that is my subject for today. And on that note, I'll start with my glasses. Unfortunately, I can't see that with my glasses, but I can see this. So this evening, I am going to start. That's not in the talk, but it is from a very interesting manuscript called the al-Jaitu, which I'm not talking about this evening, but maybe one day. So we have here an Indian dagger. It's from the 19th century in India, and it's made in a style using metal, a style called bidri. And bidri is a traditional craft from a place in India called Bidar, hence Bidri, which is in Karnataka. And it's a unique art form with a distinctive technique and has been popular for many, many centuries. So the primary material with bidri is an alloy. So it's zinc and copper mixed together, and then it's treated to create a dark surface. So when you embed it with gold or silver, it's a striking contrast, and that's the hallmark of bidri work. So the inlay technique involves taking silver wire or gold wire, and, sorry, this is just an example of a bidri chair that we have in the museum, which is, of course, from India and from the 18th century, beautiful chairs. So the technique involves etching or engraving into metal, such as this man is doing here, and then embedding the wire into it, and then it's hammered in and polished vigorously so that it looks completely smooth. It doesn't look like there's actually a thick layer of wire below it. And the process, the next step, of course, after putting the wire in, is to achieve the total black surface, and the object is subjected to a chemical treatment which oxidizes and darkens the metal further. And this, of course, creates a beautiful highlight. The chemical process involves in Bidar using, it involves soil and ash and other substances. And apparently the soil in Bidar is a specific chemical construct which creates that. So it's unique to that area, although Bidri is by no means unique to Bidar. They make all sorts of objects, of course, in Bidri, and the craft actually arrived in India from Persia and was originally called kuftgari, and some people still call it kuftgari, which is a Persian word, or two words, actually. So kuft means beaten, and gari means work, so beaten work. And the folklore in Bidar is that an old sultan, a Bahmani sultan, invited a craftsman called Abdullah bin Qaisar to Ajmer to decorate the palaces, and part of the decoration was Bidri, and that's where it was established and, of course, flourished. But Bidri work also went west. So not only east to India, but during the Mongol incursions in the region in the 13th century, metal workers fled westwards to Iraq and to Syria, and a form of this kind of craftsmanship was established there. So cities such as Mosul and later Aleppo and Damascus became famed for their own style of bidri work, inlay work. And so we have an example here. Oops, sorry, these were just, I don't think this is bidri, but the one on the right is sword hilts, which are beautiful. But this is from Mosul, which is silver on brass, and of course it's a 13th century piece, 13th, 14th century piece. It's an incense burner, And you can still see, because the Bidri workers came from the Khurasan area, and you can still see their, of course, motifs. And, well, on this side, is there a laser? Yeah, so there, first of all, you can see this knot, which was common in Central Asia, which is called the Solomon's knot, the eternal knot. And here, Dr. Hibba, are the hairs that we were looking at this morning, and the musicians, and all classic Khurasan type work, but made in Mosul. So very interesting. But our dagger today, this dagger, was a gift to an Englishman called Francis Rawdon Hastings, in this painting here, from a certain person called Ghulam Muhyiddin and his brother, who was the Nawab of Kunjura, a state in Bengal at the time, and his name was Nawab Rahmat Khan. And it was given to Rawdon when he was the Governor General of India in the very early 19th century. Francis Hastings, who later became the first Marquis of Hastings, was born in Ireland in 1754. He joined the British Army at 17 and quickly became a lieutenant, and then he was shipped off to America, where he was involved in the American War of Independence. He fought in several battles there and achieved some victories, and he's known famously for waving the British ensign in a famous painting by an artist called John Trumbull called The Death of General Warren at the Battle of Bunker Hill. And so that should be Rawdon there, waving the ensign. So he was very successful in America. He served under Lord Cornwallis, of course, had a big role in the war there. And he achieved several victories and came back to England, became Baron Rawdon, and then he also inherited a barony from his mother's side of the family. So he was involved, of course, in the House of Lords, in politics, in the Freemasons, and also in expeditions in Europe. He was then appointed governor of India, and again in India, many victories, many successes, including the Gurkha War, the conquest of the Marathas, which is a famous battle in India, and the purchase of Singapore. He resigned and then was appointed, he resigned from India, he'd had enough, and was appointed governor of Malta, and then died in a sea accident off Naples, and was buried actually in Malta, where his tomb apparently is still visited today. He kept diaries, Rawdon, and in his diaries he describes meeting certain leaders in India, including Rahmat Khan. And Rahmat Khan and Ghulam Muhyiddin, his brother, were grandsons of the Nawab Najabat Khan, who was a hero Pathan warrior and a founder of a kingdom called Kunjpura. And it was Nadir Shah, of course, the emperor, in 1739 who made him a Nawab. And in the early 19th century, Najabat Khan, their grandfather, established a stronghold along the Jumna River, became very wealthy from trade there, and built a fort which is still there called, of course, the ruins, called Kunjpura Fort. And so our dagger, Rawdon's dagger, is a very fine piece with beautiful Bidri work, really. It's a lovely little dagger. Next, we have, staying with the blades, we have a sword by a swordsmith called Asadullah Isfahani. Now, he was, of course, a swordsmith, as you can tell by the name, from Isfahan in Iran, and he was known famously to have dedicated a sword to Shah Abbas, of the first of Persia. He's a very, very famous figure in Persian sword making, and he made many of his own contributions to sword making. of course, he was born in Isfahan, a very culturally rich city with many craftsmen and artisans, of course, and with probably the best sword, along with Damascus, probably the highest quality swords came from Isfahan. And he trained there, he learnt his trade there through, of course, apprenticeship and study. And his training involved mastering certain techniques of sword making, including forging, tempering, decorating swords, which are crucial for high quality weapons. He was known in Europe until the 19th century. Then his name sort of went into obscurity, but certain European travelers wrote about him, including a Swiss traveler called Moser who collected swords and mentioned a sword made by Asad-Ullah that he acquired from the Emir of Bukhara, who was the Emir who was defeated by the Russians in 1866. There are several other academic sources who mention Asad-Ullah and also mention two swords he made for Shah Abbas. So one, who's pictured here, one sword had a handle like a ram's head. Unfortunately, I couldn't find pictures of these swords. And one sword had a hilt with a horse's head and a curved blade. Of course, we have in the museum, I mean, it was probably more elaborate than this, but it was, these are quite common sword hilts in the region. And again, these high-quality swords required a very, very meticulous process of folding and hammering the steel. So you repeatedly fold, hammer, and it creates a pattern in the steel. So the next skill was the skill of pattern welding. And so if you want to make so you could make a random pattern if you kept doing this with the same metal, but if you want to do a specific pattern, you could combine different types of steel together, and you could get, well, this is a regular pattern, but you could get, very controlled and beautiful patterns, actually. Actually, the Japanese make swords like that, too. So you're mixing different metals, and you get, you've created like an artwork out of it. So these are all swords just made by the folding of steel. The swords, of course, typically have a curved design, such as this sword from the Metropolitan Museum. And, of course, the scabbards and the hilts could be very, very, very elaborate. But having said that, the most important part of the sword, especially a sword of this quality, was the blade itself. But was Isfahani a real person? Was Asad-Ullah a real person, or was he a name invented to market swords? And the scholars have argued both sides of the story. I mean, it does seem that there was a person called Asad-Ullah in the 16th century who made swords, but swords made by him cover 2 centuries. So obviously he didn't make the sword that was made in the 18th century. So what's behind this name? One piece of evidence for an Asad-Ullah was by a scholar called Lambton, who mentions in her work that there was a certain swordsmith called Asad who was summoned by Shah Abbas when Shah Abbas received a helmet from the Ottoman Sultan. And the Ottoman Sultan was going to offer a reward to anyone who could make a sword that was strong enough to split the helmet in two. And Asad was the successful candidate. And after Asad's success in splitting the helmet, of course, the man got his reward, but Shah Abbas also ended the taxation of sword makers in Isfahan. And so the specific quality and style sort of Asadullah signed swords is also an indicator. So if they're signed with a stamp of Asadullah, they're almost invariably a very, very high quality blade. And there's also a tradition mentioned again by Lambton up until the 40s, so World War II, of people actually visiting a grave in Isfahan, just outside Isfahan, which was supposedly the grave of Asad Allah. And so alternatively, people on the other side argue that a sword, Asadullah sword, is merely a trademark to market very high quality swords. So it's not necessarily made by a person, but it's made in the school of Asadullah. And so there's no proof either way. But it's good to believe that Asadullah was a swordsmith once, and he had a tradition, much like calligraphers, like Yaqut al-Mastasmi. He had a school, and his grandchildren in the school were of that kind of quality. And there are swords by him all over, of course, in the British Museum. And we have two of his swords. Of course, we have this one here, but you can see this is not an original. The blade is original, but the actual scabbard and the hilt are much later additions, which look more like they're from the Arabian Peninsula than from Persia. So it's probably a sword where the hilt has fallen off or worn off and then been remodeled. So these swords, the blades were kept, of course, for generations. We have one more sword. It won't take too long, in case. So we have a sword called the Bahadur, again, back to India, Bahadur Burdwan sword. So this sword belonged to a person called B.J. Chand Mehtab, who was the Bahadur of Bardaman, or Burdwan, as it was called during the British period, in British India, and the area is now in West Bengal. So the title, Bahadur of Bardaman, refers to a high-ranking noble or a ruler of this estate, called the Bardaman estate, in West Bengal. And Bahadur actually is a Persian word which means brave, and was often used in India to denote a person of rank. So the title could mean a ruler or head of a Raj, and specifically the Burdwan Raj in British India. This was one of the most prominent estates in Bengal, and of course was known for its significant influence in the region. And the rulers, known as the Mehtabs or the Nawabs, had very important roles in administration, culture, and politics, etc., in the region. And BJ, who lived until the 19th century, 20th century, was a prominent Bahadur of Burdwan, and he served as a ruler and a leader with very much influence, was very popular with the British. And he was born in 1881. He inherited the estate in 1887 when he was only 6 years old, after his relative, the Maharaja Aftab Chand, died with no heirs. But the Maharaja's widow, of course, considered BJ to be suitable for the role because he was a close relative of the previous Maharaja. But of course, the estate was managed by a court of wards, very rich state in West Bengal. He was the first in his family to go to university, so he attended Calcutta University. And in 1902, of course, he was invested with ruling powers. And the following year, at the Delhi Durbar, of course, seen here, this was in 1903, he was honored with the title of Raja Diraj. So it was actually the British who gave him this Indian title. And the Delhi Durbar at the time was an imperial-style mass assembly organized by the British in Coronation Park in Delhi. And it was normally held to mark the succession of an emperor or an empress of India. and it was held 3 times, 1877, 1903, and 1911. And during his investiture, actually, Bijay also received praise for saving the life of Lieutenant Governor Sir Andrew Fraser during an assassination attempt. In 1908, the Lord at the time, Minto, elevated him to an even higher rank, which was Maharaja di Raja, on a hereditary basis. He was very involved in politics and in philanthropic works. He established a college and a hospital. And so his sword's actually got a beautiful hilt. And this was the sword which was presented to him at the Durbar. Of course, made in India, but presented by the British. And staying in India, we next have a shield, which some of you, of course, might have seen previously. So this is a carved buffalo hide shield from the 19th century. Indian shields were called dal and made in, of course, many different materials, including wood, metal, and leather. Some were very plain, and others very elaborately decorated. This particular one, not ours, but this particular one is rhinoceros hide. And here's a beautiful metal one with bidri work on it, too. It's very elaborate. Obviously ceremonial, most probably more than actual functional. And leather carving, of course, was an ancient craft and still is in India. And we have here an example of a Mughal or Deccani carved leather shield, late 17th, early 18th century. It was common enough, of course, leather, but it didn't survive as well as metal, say. And our shield are actually particularly fine. I mean, the work in it is exquisite and very, very detailed and fine. And it has metal bosses on it, which are studied with some little gems. Obviously, again, a ceremonial sword. And what's interesting about the shield is that the design carved into it, you can see the tree there and the palm tree at the top and the vine. You can see the palm trees again there and the entwining vines. And these depict the windows of a famous mosque in a city in India called Ahmedabad. And the mosque is called the Sidi Sayyid Mosque, which is shown here in this picture. And of course, in the mosque, each of the windows, which you can see there, is what is represented in the shield. So that's a closer image of the mosque. And this mosque, on the back of the shield, it mentions the name of the maker, which was a shield maker in Ahmedabad, probably early to mid-19th century. And there's also an inscription stating that it was sent to be exhibited at the Colonial and Indian Exhibition in England in London in 1886, which was an exhibition which was actually promoted and not managed but patronized by the Prince of Wales at the time, and it was to promote different regions in the British Empire. And it was, of course, to promote trade and commerce. And for example, so India was, of course, as everyone knows, the jewel in the crown at the time. And the products that were sent, of course, were of top quality. And for example, the Maharaja of Jaipur actually constructed a gate there. So he had a gate built, which is shown here in the exhibition, sent to England with workers and assembled at the exhibition. And the gate is today in Hove, which is a little town next to Brighton. But for us, our family, what's interesting about this gate is the logo on the front, shown there, Ex Oriente Lux, which actually means light comes from the east. And it was only, investigating this and finding this gate at the the Indian and Colonial exhibition, that it struck me that the motto, I think, of our school, which is Ex Oriente Lux, my father must have picked up from there, because he was a student in Eastbourne in 1953. And of course, Brighton and Hove were places he went to frequently. And I'm certain he must have taken that, which he used in his later life in 1969, when he opened the school. Light comes from the east, which means learning comes from the east. We move on. This is not in our museum. We have another one, but I thought this is a beautiful one, so I put it as the heading page. So this is a folio from a Shahnama called the Shahnama of Tahmasp. Now, this Shahnama, also known as the Horton Shahnama, is a very, very famous masterpiece of Persian art and literature. It's famous for its beautiful illustrations and, of course, the craftsmanship in the calligraphy. It's one of the most elaborately decorated and illustrated versions of the Shahnama. So the Shahnama, I'm sure most of you know, but for those of you who don't, is the Book of Kings, which is a famous poem written by the poet Ferdowsi in the 11th century. It consists of 50,000 rhyming couplets recounting the history of pre-Islamic Iran's kings. So from the mythical beginnings right up until the Arab conquest in the earlier 7th century. Many, many manuscripts of the Shahnama have been made, but by far the most elaborate was the Shahnama of Shah Tahmasp. Now, this Shahnama was commissioned by Shah Ismail I, the founder of the Safavid dynasty, and he commissioned it shortly after he took control of Tabriz. He was a dynamic leader, and he wanted to assert his dominance through very elaborate and impressive displays of art and culture. So for this project, he engaged some of the most famous artists in the empire at the time, and at the top of them, of course, was a very well-known artist called Muzaffar Ali, who probably managed the project and did many of the illustrations. The actual complete book is 759 pages and includes 258 beautiful illustrations. And they were, of course, painted in the palace in Tabriz under the guidance of Shah Ismail I himself. It began in the 1520s, it continued into the 30s, and although Shah Ismail I died in 1524, it then proceeded under Shah Tahmasp, who was only a child at the time, but obviously the advisors had been instructed to continue with the project. It was written in a very high-quality Nastaliq script, shown as you can see here. And around two decades after it was completed, Shah Tahmasp gave it as a gift to the new Ottoman Sultan Selim II upon his accession to the throne in Istanbul. And apparently the book was sent to Istanbul with an entourage of 34 camels, along with many, many other gifts, including fabulous silk carpets and a pear-shaped ruby. And of course, the book was the prize in this entourage of gifts. And of course, these gifts were to promote the grandeur of the Safavid Empire, and there was actually not much love lost between the Ottomans and the Safavids, and he wanted to show the Ottomans that his empire was actually supreme. And so our folio here, Sultan Selim, is the title, the folio shows the death of Yazdegerd III, who was the last Sasanian Shah of Persia. And this is in a tragic event called involving a water horse. And of course, water horse, which is depicted here, is probably a metaphorical or symbolic reference rather than, an actual creature. So Yazdegerd ascended the throne, the Sasanian throne, in 632 AD, which at the time was a very, very tumultuous period in the region due to the continuing Arab conquests eastwards and westwards. And his reign, of course, saw the collapse of the Sasanian Empire. The empire's collapse, of course, happened after the conquest of Persia, which happened before 64 AD. During the advance, of course, Yazdegerd was fleeing eastwards, seeking refuge in various towns and provinces, until he eventually arrived in Merv, which is in Turkmenistan today, called Meri, I think, today, which was a very important city. Accounts state that Yazdegerd, of course, died in 651 in Merv, and the term water horse is found in many accounts of his death. And so people argue that the water horse may symbolize a river or a watery grave associated with his death. And one account suggests that Yazdegerd was betrayed by his supporters who, dissatisfied with his leadership, killed him perhaps in a watermill or in a river. And hence the fairy tale, I suppose, of Yazdegerd and the water horse emerged. That was the end of the Sasanian Empire, and this folio really is quite a poignant reminder of that end. But in modern times, this book also has an interesting, and we could say a tragic, history. So it was kept in the Topkapi for 300 years, until the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in the early 20th century. And then it disappeared for a while, until it emerged a bit later, a few years later after the collapse, in the collection of Baron Edmund de Rothschild, one of the Rothschilds in France. He then passed it on to his son. Nobody knows how he acquired it. Of course, it could have been smuggled out, sold, who knows. And then passed on to his grandson, who then sold it to New York for a handsome sum. It was purchased by a collector, Arthur Horton. Sorry, that was just the detail. Pictured here, who was a bibliophile, collected books. And he had, much to the shock of the art world, he had the book unbound to take the pages apart and to showcase the folios in galleries in his apartment in New York. To much criticism, of course, but he remained unfazed. He donated 78 of them to the Metropolitan Museum. And in 1976, he put up 6 of them for sale at Christie's in New York. And critics suggest he did this to determine the value of the folios so that he could then settle some tax dues as he was being investigated by the Inland Revenue. There was an investigation into his finances. And before he died in 1990, he'd sold 62 pages, which, of course, was tragic. Tragic in a way. And in the meantime, the Shah of Iran, at the time, so before he died and before 1979, had been negotiating to buy the book. And Horton didn't sell it to him at first, and it said that he was insulted by... I heard yesterday from, I think it was Edward Gibbs. I think you saw him too, Sheikh Hastad, didn't you? He said around 20 million he was offered for it, which Horton, of course, thought was a mockery of this priceless work of art. So some people say, to spite the Shah of Iran, he took these folios apart. Eventually, however, he managed to sell the remaining part of the book. So not all the illustrations, but a section of them, plus the actual poetry in the book. He didn't sell it. He exchanged it for a painting owned by the Empress Farah Diba, which was a William Kooning painting called Woman 3, which at the time was the most expensive painting in the world, but couldn't be exhibited in Persia in in Iran, in the Museum of Contemporary Art, because it depicted an unclothed woman. So they exchanged it. They received the rest of the Shahnameh, where it still is, and there are several in the museum in Tehran. So beautiful, beautiful manuscript. This was one of the ones in Tehran. And these are in the Khalili collection. He's very lucky to have 10. Actually, I think he sold some of them. Next, we have a scientific work, which is a very special and important book by a famous Arab philosopher, scientist called Yaqub ibn Ishaq al-Kindi, and dated around 867. And Yaqub al-Kindi was a very, very favored and honored scientist by the caliphs al-Ma'mun and al-Mu'tasim. He was a prominent philosopher, which sometimes is called the philosopher of the Arabs, Philosoph al-Arab, and his contributions to philosophy and science were hugely significant in that very early Abbasid Islamic period. He's believed to have been born in Kufa in around 800 AD, but lived most his early life in Basra, where his father was the governor. He was then moved to Baghdad to further his education, and his intellectual career reached a pinnacle during the reign of Caliph al-Mu'tasim. And he dedicated one of his works called On First Philosophy, Fil Falsafa al-Ula, to al-Mu'tasim. He had a very, very big role in the translation movement at the time. So this was a big movement which was aimed at translating Greek works, as well as Persian and Indian, into Arabic. And this was considered crucial for the intellectual development of the region. And he led one of the major translation circles called the Al-Kindi Circle. But apart from translations, he wrote countless original treatises on many subjects, including metaphysics, logic, ethics, psychology, medicine, pharmacology, astronomy, jewelry, perfume making, mathematics, zoology, weather. I mean, he was a polymath, a real Renaissance man. And his output, as I said, was vast. And we know about many of his works which have been lost, but we know about them because of a 10th century bibliographer called Ibn al-Nadim. Now, he wrote a book called Kitab al-Fihrist, or the book catalogue, which is a compendium of knowledge and literature of the 10th century Islamic world. He references approximately 10,000 books, 2,000 authors of the Islamic world, but then also includes authors and references of Greek, Persian, Indian, and Syrian origin. So his compendium includes references and works which would have been lost forever had he not actually mentioned and written about them. So he wouldn't just mention the work, he wrote about al-Kindi, and he explained what kind of a person was, what his reputation was, and so on. And so this book that we have is called Kitab al-Shu'a'at fil Maraya al-Muhriqa, or in English, the Book of Rays in the Mirrors of the Blazing Fire. And it's written in Naskhi script. It dates to the late 9th, early 10th century, and is dedicated to Amir al-Mu'minin, the Caliph. And it's significant because it deals with the nature of light and optical phenomena. It has several illustrations in it, 16 in red, and its evidence evident that it was copied during the lifetime of the author. And I mean, we think it's not unreasonable to assume that it's an autograph copy. And it was collated and checked against a correct copy. That's a later owner. So some research on that book would be good. Next, we have another book, which is a treatise by a person called Qusta ibn Luqa, which is Kitab Jarr al-Athqal wa Ajaib al-A'mal, or the book of weighing the scales and the wonders of actions, which is an important book on mechanical physics and specifically to heavy objects and other related topics. And it was compiled by Qusta ibn Luqa al-Ba'albaki, who was a famous philosopher and physician, who, like al-Kindi, distinguished himself in other branches such as geometry, natural history, and so on. He was actually born in 820 in Baalbek in Lebanon today, and produced many important works dedicated to al-Ma'mun, of course, who was the son of Harun al-Rashid. This work is very rare, and there are 3 or 4 copies, but the oldest is at the Sulaymaniya Library in Istanbul, dated 1474. And this manuscript, of course, this is not written by Luqa, but it's... that went quickly. I've got so much more to say. Yeah, no, I can't, because, I mean, I was going to tell you a bit more about the book. He was also mentioned by Ibn Nadim, who wrote actually quite a bit about who he was and how important he was, also in the translation movement, because he was a multilinguist, traveled all through the Byzantine Empire collecting Greek works, and then headed to Baghdad, where he established himself there, and of course his patron was the caliph. And it has several diagrams in red in the book. So a beautiful book. I was going to, so it's, I mean, my time is up. So he was famous for discussing and researching the armillary square, which is basically an astrolabe in 3 dimensions, such as this one here. And I was going to talk about the Emir of Bukhara's jewelry, but unfortunately I can't. 5 more minutes. Right. Unfortunately, we had to rush through Ba'albaki. So this jewelry is from the collection of the family of the Emir of Bukhara. And even though it's Uzbek, my mother, Jihan, according to her, it had many Kazakh elements in it as well. And the enamel work was most probably done in Bukhara, where turquoise inlay, gem inlay, and enamel work were, of course, famous. There are many Russian influences there, and that's because Bukhara was on a big crossroads between China, India, the Middle East, and Russia. And so there are influences in their enamel work from all these areas. And so Bukhara is right up there. That's Merv next to it. So this collection, and this was the last Emir of Bukhara who was deposed by the Red Army in 1920, of course. And we have a big collection, 70 pieces in it, of different styles. This is a famous headdress of which we have several, called the koshitulo, which means the golden eyebrows. And people say it was designed that way to follow the shape of the eyebrows, which were prized there. So these are just different types. So it's a magnificent collection. This is another type of necklace. And also there's the the giant necklaces, such as this one here, which weighs many kilos, and it's actually huge, and probably used in ceremonies around a horse's neck. And of course, there was a hinge at the top, and you could open it, and the Quran would be stored inside it. And we have several of those, such as these here, very large. And these are armbands, actually, which are made with one piece of silver, as well as a hinged necklace there. And I shall end now, because I know it's 10 to. And I'm sorry I haven't been able to finish my objects, because I had a nice collection of tantours to show you, which is what my mother used to like to collect, and which was worn by the Druze in Lebanon. But maybe another time, inshallah. So thank you very much.